don't know if you personally see a difference between world building and lore, you've never thought about it before, or you just rather experience your process than apply labels to it, which is valid, but the way I see it, and I'm not the first to make this delineation, world building is much more expensive. It is a writer's eye view on the world as a whole. It is an act. It is the doing.
The doing, yes. Yes, the doing.
Then there's lore. The very definition of the word infers a sense of mystery, and that is because we are introducing a barrier to knowledge. It is a singular perspective, not objective truth. That information could be skewed. There is a lot more uncertainty, a belief. It could be wrong. It could only be half right. It's how the concrete world building you have is exposited. The unraveling of your world as your characters see it, and by extension, the reader. So essentially, it's what frames the entirety of the world building. If world building is the sun, then lore is the lens that focuses it. But why do I make it a point to differentiate the two? And why do I focus more on one over the other? You just love building a world, and so you do, and then maybe try to find a story in that world, one just comes to you? Or do you explore the story first, then follow whatever world building thread that pops up, before eventually solidifying and expanding afterwards? Story or world first? It's a cosmetic difference, right? No major advantage either way. Yet it's still very important, however, to this whole world building and lore discussion. It's basically architects versus gardeners, but specifically for the world. Because you're an architect for your plot and story doesn't necessarily mean you'll do as much planning for your world building. I sit squarely in the middle. It's different for every piece, but stories usually start from a character for me. I'll build around them, then thoroughly plan out and dive into the story when I feel comfortable writing in that world. Then just come up with whatever else my world needs on the fly and pat it down to fit with everything else. That being said, architects for the stories usually tend to be architects for the world as well, and vice versa. Gardeners will dive into the story immediately they fall in love with a central concept or idea. Not a single plan inside because they're insane and they scare me. But since they're already in the story when they come up with any piece of world building, it's colored by at least one perspective. It's always lore, always biased information painted from that character's point of view, only coming up when it's relevant. You're writing and world building on the fly, and you may make notes, but most of it is done afterwards. And even though I lean more towards the other half, it's not without its flaws. If you plan the information about your world beforehand, you have a tendency to convey that information wholesale, because it's there, you know it. I always urge writers to study their process. Everyone has a unique pipeline they run their work through. And the more you understand that process, the more you can streamline. The easier it is to integrate parts from other people's process, and the more repeatable it is. Again, every writer and every piece is going to be different. It's about finding your core storytelling tools. Thinking about it this way might be antithetical to your mode of operation, but at the end of the day, it's your prerogative. Having experimented with both styles, front-loading is more prone to that info dump problem I just mentioned. But backloading the world building leaves me with a draft that only contains what is necessary for the plot, which first left me with the question, why is that a bad thing? You don't want the story bloated with unnecessary world building, but at the same time, the moment anyone dives below surface level, there's nothing there. But it brings me back to lore. Whether your world building revisions are mostly additive or reductive, when there is a happy medium, seamless harmony between the core world building that needs to be exposited and the concepts on the fringes, to me that's the mark of great world building. It's tricky, but nailing that means there's as much depth as anyone wants to see, and that is where a world starts to feel lived in. That being said, I found I prefer barely enough world building rather than too much. I've said world building is the sun and lore is the lens that focuses it, but that metaphor is actually just the iceberg theory. We don't need to do another explanation, but that 10% that's peeking out of the water is the lore of your world, the part your characters and readers actually interact with and color with their own perspective. The other 90% below the surface, the part they barely see, that's the rest of the world building you have. Again, you want both, but the reason I say I prefer a world that gives me less instead of more is because of curiosity and mystery. 10% is just an arbitrary number I picked. It depends on the story. It's usually more for larger stories, styles that thrive off logical consistency, harder worlds. But you're still not going to show a majority of the world building you've come up with. One, because the more information you want to convey, the more skillful you need to be to not have the prose be the clunkiest thing ever written. And two, readers are smart. They're going to infer, they're going to make connections and come up with theories. I actually haven't gotten into Soulsborne games as much as I'd like, but from what I understand, they're very much styled like this. Letting the player discover the story with bits and pieces of information. Very interactive and collaborative world building. Or random, this Batman short story from the Gotham Knights animated movie that's really fun. It paints a picture with flashbacks and retellings using these kids in a Gotham skate park to portray the Cape Crusader as this urban legend. Completely different every time, and you slowly get an inkling of what's actually happening. Not everyone is going to love how much you have to dig to get the story. Of course, preferences are going to be different, so write the story you want to write, but I've also never heard a reader go, yeah, I just love this writer spelling out every single nuance of their world in excruciating detail like I'm a 2-year-old. Nobody wants to be spoon-fed, even babies. Again, the plot your story covers is probably going to interact with a small part of the world, and maybe loosely touch on the others. Showing the entirety of those other parts is just you going, hey, look at all this cool extra world building I did. And don't look at me, I agree with you, it is cool world building. But I've talked about how writers create immersive worlds before, and a huge part of it, to me at least, is figuring out where you draw the line for how much to give. How much room you allow the reader's imagination to run wild versus how much you choose to lay out for them. You learn by doing. But I'm currently in the middle of brainstorming a sci-fi short story, and my shorts process is much more messy and visual, which makes Milanote fantastic for it. I pretty much have a digital whiteboard where I can just brain dump whatever ideas get me excited to write the piece. I can also start working on the story structure, and there are templates for that, though I like to create my own, which it perfectly allows. I also collect notes for research, and this is great for that. I can pair those notes with the right images, which just leads to even more inspiration. Collages, mood boards, character sheets. If you're a visual thinker, this is pretty awesome. The story kind of takes place on a spaceship wreck, and I mood boarded the different sections, which help me plan out different scenes. And it's not just limited to me as a writer, any creative endeavor is game, honestly. Photography, illustration, video making. I'm actually trying to integrate this into my YouTube ideation process as well. And you can easily share your boards if it's a collaborative project. I recommend giving Milanote a test run at least. It's completely free, no trial period. Experiment with your next creative project. Link is in the description, and thanks to Milanote for sponsoring this video. But back to the topic at hand, if showing everything is not ideal, it immediately begs the question, what exactly do you show, and how do you show it? The former half of that question largely depends on what is necessary. Okay, maybe necessary isn't the right word. There's no clear divider between what is and what isn't. That's why finding that line is so difficult. A better way to phrase it, I think, is what is essential to understanding the story. Every other world building concept after that can elevate the story, and I don't want to say they're not important, but they don't take precedence, and can impact the story negatively in excess. How much of a backseat varies across the spectrum of fantasy and its subgenres. Hard fantasy is going to get more leeway for this stuff than contemporary fantasy. My 2 cents, don't worry about genre too much. Again, write the story you want to write. But how much of what is being shown is dependent on the writer, their process, the story in question, the genre. I think it's about time I drop a fat writing is subjective. That being said, aspects of world and setting I would deem essential to understanding the story are simply concepts that drive conflict. Technology, cultural diversity, magic systems, even story building concepts like red herrings and plot devices. It's actually pretty common that world building concepts affect the story as plot devices. Like tropes, plot devices aren't inherently negative, it depends on the execution. Technically, everything is a plot device. It's all fabricated to work exactly how the story wants. Readers only tend to notice when it doesn't work. How fabricated it feels though is going to depend on how well you use storytelling tools, setup and payoff and the like. The babblefish in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy could easily be the most contrived thing ever, especially since the whole story kind of relies on it to work. This universal communication device, or creature rather, that you put in your ear and can understand every single language. But it's attached to other world building concepts, fits the tone of the story, and never contradicts its own laws, and so it works. But remember, I said how vast and lived in a world feels is very dependent on how seamlessly it transitions between the parts that interact with the larger plot and the parts that don't. That trickle-down effect is something I've discussed before, with a handful of concepts trailblazing and offshoots sprouting their own lore. A lot of storytellers actually world build like this, almost like a skill tree in a video game expanding, and oh look at that, it's the iceberg again. The further along the skill tree we go, the more you expand your world beyond those core interactive components, the less they matter to the overall plot. That's kind of why they're beneath the water. I'm mixing and matching metaphors again, which means it's time to look at a concrete example in Dune. Major world building corners in Dune are 1. The economy of planets and resource management, political houses, as well as religious and cultural groups. Step down a level, more refined, more detailed, and we have the desert planet of Arrakis, the Spice Melange, House Atreides and House Harkonnen, the Bene Gesserits, the Fremen. Another step lower and we get the Sandworm, the Mentats, minor houses, and it keeps going and going. But if you've ever read Dune, like a lot of stories, the less impactful elements are not quite irrelevant to the story as a whole. Those world building elements that are in the transition zone and on the fringes might not matter as much to the plot, but they can still affect a lot. These elements add to the tone, enhance themes, characterization Characterization is so sweet when it's done well. Again, excess can breed negative impact, but you can pretty much justify anything if you characterize it through a point of view. The First Law trilogy is fantastic at this. It is so packed with incredible character work. Their personalities just leap off the page and color the entire narrative. You barely even notice the world unraveling in front of you. You don't just hear about the savage Northmen living in the lawless, frigid wasteland. Instead, you get the perspective of a character whose life has been dyed in blood and the creature they've had to become to survive that place. As much as we like to geek out about this stuff, the characters and the narrative will almost always be the drivers. Understanding that means you can put your cool little world building in the passenger seat and ferry them off. I mean, if you're gonna spoon feed me, do the damn airplane first at least. And we've already started to touch on the latter half of this question. How do you deliver that essential information? Characterizing isn't the same as using a character to info dump, but making that information be of narrative significance to the character. Avoiding maid and butler dialogue is actually pretty common advice. Characters talking about things they already know for the sake of the audience.
Hey maid, as you know, the master is out today.
And as you know, butler, he most likely snuck out to meet his mistress again.
And as you know, the lady of the house is not going to like that.
Nobody wants to be spoon-fed. But let's say this information is actually pretty relevant to the plot. Let's apply our characterization cheat code and see the difference.
The master's out again.
Mistress?
Mistress.
That man. Oh, the lady's going to be hitting the liquor tonight.
4 lines of dialogue and we know the master's out, cheating is a regular occurrence, it's not a secret, staff has a little disdain but mostly indifference, and they are wary of how wifey chooses to deal with it. Everything being revealed affects a character in some way, paints a picture of them. And ideally, it would be done in a way that's natural to the context of the scene.
Explain it all to me, now!
These guys are gossips and they probably cross paths in the kitchen, rather than randomly telling each other information they're already supposed to know. Environmental details also just weave that lore in there naturally and subtly. Show don't tell is a writing mantra at this point, and I have my gripes with it, but it's mostly good advice. Neon lights and cybernetics at every corner, people would rather escape to a virtual reality, aircrafts weaving through giant sardine-packed skyscrapers. We immediately understand dystopian cyberpunk world. Again, readers are going to pick up on stuff. They're going to build wonder and curiosity, and the more you lay out for them without crossing that spoon-feeding threshold, the higher that curiosity is going to grow and the more you can feed them. It's actually like the Batman story I talked about earlier. You get a little more information each time from the different perspective of the kids. You know it's just a billionaire in a batsuit who needs a lot of therapy, but the very short runtime manages to pique enough curiosity to make you wonder what's actually going on with this villain he's fighting all over the city. As for the little world building tidbits that are just fun and have no real bearing on anything aside from tone and atmosphere, but you just want to add them anyway, that's okay, as it naturally comes up in the narrative. Meaning, if you're telling me about how the Cobalt Bank, for instance, controls the finances of this world, and I'm actually intrigued and hooked because it affects the story, it might not be the best place to mention the cool flora and fauna. Might be the place to drop how the currency coin splits up to form change and can magnetize back together. But leave the cool flora tidbit to the assassination scene with a toxicologist. Hope the ball is rolling. World building is great. It is necessary, and though daunting, it can be an incredibly fun process. And maybe you don't follow everything I said, maybe you don't agree with some of it, maybe your process is wildly different. There are always exceptions, but how that world building is delivered will almost always take precedence and can make or break the story. A deeper discussion into how authors create immersive worlds is available in this video right here. But that's it from me. Okay, bye.